This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Chapter 56. One morning, about a week after Bingley's engagement with Jane had been formed, as he and the females of the family were sitting together in the dining room, their attention was suddenly drawn to the window by the sound of a carriage, and they perceived a chaise and four driving up the lawn. It was too early in the morning for visitors, and besides, the equipage did not answer to that of any of their neighbours. The horses were post, and neither the carriage nor the livery of the servant who preceded it were familiar to them. As it was certain, however, that somebody was coming, Bingley instantly prevailed on Miss Bennet to avoid the confinement of such an intrusion, and walk away with him into the shrubbery. They both set off, and the conjectures of the remaining three continued, though with little satisfaction, till the door was thrown open and their visitor entered. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. They were, of course, all intending to be surprised, but their astonishment was beyond their expectation, and on the part of Miss Bennet and Kitty, though she was perfectly unknown to them, even inferior to what Elizabeth felt. She entered the room with an air more than usually ungracious, made no other reply to Elizabeth's salutation than a slight inclination of the head, and sat down without saying a word. Elizabeth had mentioned her name to her mother on her ladyship's entrance, though no request of introduction had been made. Miss Bennet, all amazement, though flattered by having a guest of such high importance, received her with the utmost politeness. After sitting for a moment in silence, she said very stiffly to Elizabeth, "I hope you are well, Miss Bennet. That lady, I suppose, is your mother?" Elizabeth replied very concisely that she was. "And that, I suppose, is one of your sisters?" "Yes, madame," said Mrs. Bennet, delighted to speak to a Lady Catherine. "She is my youngest girl but one. My youngest of all is lately married, and my eldest is somewhere about the grounds, walking with a young man who, I believe, will soon become a part of the family." "You have a very small park here," returned Lady Catherine after a short silence. "It is nothing in comparison of Rosings, my lady, I dare say, but I assure you it is much larger than St. William Lucas's." "This must be the most inconvenient sitting-room for the evening in summer. The windows are full west." Mrs. Bennet assured her that they never sat there after dinner, and then added, "May I take the liberty of asking your ladyship whether you left Mr. and Mrs. Collins well?" "Yes, very well. I saw them the night before last." Elizabeth now expected that she would produce a letter for her from Charlotte, as it seemed the only probable motive for her calling. But no letter appeared, and she was completely puzzled. Mrs. Bennet, with great civility, begged her ladyship to take some refreshment, but Lady Catherine very resolutely, and not very politely, declined eating anything, and then, rising up, said to Elizabeth, "Miss Bennet, there seemed to be a prettyish kind of a little wilderness on one side of your lawn. I should be glad to take a turn in it, if you will favour me with your company." "Go, my dear," cried her mother, "and show her ladyship about the different walks. I think she will be pleased with the hermitage." Elizabeth obeyed, and running into her own room for her parasol, attended her noble guest downstairs. As they passed to the hall, Lady Catherine opened the doors into the dining parlour and drawing-room, and pronouncing them, after a short survey, to be decent-looking rooms, walked on. Her carriage remained at the door, and Elizabeth saw that her waiting-woman was in it. They proceeded in silence along the gravel walk that led to the copse. Elizabeth was determined to make no effort for conversation with a woman who was now more than usually insolent and disagreeable. "How could I ever think her like her nephew?" said she, as she looked into her face. As soon as they entered the copse, Lady Catherine began in the following manner. "You can be at no loss, Miss Bennet, to understand the reason of my journey hither. Your own heart, your own conscience, must tell you why I come." Elizabeth looked with unaffected astonishment. Indeed, you are mistaken, madame. I have not been able at all to account for the honour of seeing you here. Miss Bennet, replied her ladyship in an angry tone, you ought to know that I am not to be trifled with. But however insincere you may choose to be, you shall not find me so. My character has been ever celebrated for its sincerity and frankness, and in a cause of such moments as this, I shall certainly not depart from it. A report of a most alarming nature reached me 2 days ago. I was told that not only your sister was on the point of being most advantageously married, but that Miss Elizabeth Bennet, would, in all likelihood, be soon afterwards united to my nephew, my own nephew, Mr. Darcy. Though I know it must be a scandalous falsehood, though I would not injure him so much as to suppose the truth of it possible, I instantly resolved on setting off for this place, that I might make my sentiments known to you. If you believed it impossible to be true, said Elizabeth, colouring with astonishment and disdain, I wonder you took the trouble of coming so far. What could your ladyship propose by it? At once to insist upon having such a report universally contradicted. Your coming to Longbourn to see me and my family, said Elizabeth coolly, will rather be a confirmation of it, if, indeed, such a report is in existence. If? Do you then pretend to be ignorant of it? Has it not been industriously circulated by yourselves? Do you not know that such a report is spread abroad? I never heard that it was. And can you likewise declare that there is no foundation for it? I do not pretend to possess equal frankness with your ladyship. You may ask questions which I shall not choose to answer. This is not to be borne. Miss Bennet, I insist on being satisfied. Has my nephew made you an offer of marriage? Your ladyship has declared it to be impossible. It ought to be so. It must be so, while he retains the use of his reason. But your arts and allurements may, in a moment of infatuation, have made him forget what he owes to himself and to all his family. You may have drawn him into it. If I have, I shall be the last person to confess it. Miss Bennet, do you know who I am? I have not been accustomed to such language as this. I am almost the nearest relation he has in the world, and am entitled to know all his dearest concerns. But you are not entitled to know mine, nor will such behaviour as this ever induce me to be explicit. Let me be rightly understood. This match, to which you have the presumption to aspire, can never take place. No, never. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now what have you to say? Only this, that if he is so, you can have no reason to suppose he will make an offer to me. Lady Catherine hesitated for a moment, and then replied, The engagement between them is of a peculiar kind. From their infancy, they have been intended for each other. It was the favourite wish of his mother's, as well as of hers. While in their cradles we planned the union, and now, at the moment when the wishes of both sisters would be accomplished in their marriage, to be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth, of no importance to the world, and wholly unallied to the family? Do you pay no regard to the wishes of his friends? To his tacit engagement with Mr. Burr? Have you lost to every feeling of propriety and delicacy? Have you not heard me say that from his earliest hours he was destined for his cousin? Yes, and I have heard it before. But what is that to me? If there is no other objection to my marrying your nephew, I shall certainly not be kept from it by knowing that his mother and aunt wished him to marry Mr. Burr. You both did as much as you could in planning the marriage. Its completion depended on others. If Mr. Darcy is neither by honour nor inclination confined to his cousin, why is he not to make another choice? And if I am that choice, why may I not accept it? Because honour, decorum, prudence, nay, interest forbid it. Yes, Miss Bennet, interest. For do not expect to be noticed by his family or friends if you wilfully act against the inclinations of all. You will be censured, slighted, and despised by everyone connected with him. Your alliance will be a disgrace. Your name will never even be mentioned by any of us." "These are heavy misfortunes," replied Elizabeth. "But the wife of Mr. Darcy must have such extraordinary sources of happiness necessarily attached to her situation, that she could, upon the whole, have no cause to repine." "Obstinate, headstrong girl, I am ashamed of you. Is this your gratitude for my attentions to you last spring? Is nothing due to me on that score? Let us sit down. You are to understand, Miss Bennet, that I came here with the determined resolution of carrying my purpose, nor will I be dissuaded from it. I have not been used to submit to any person's whims. I have not been in the habit of brooking disappointment." "That will make your ladyship's situation at present more pitiable, but it will have no effect on me." "I will not be interrupted. Hear me in silence. My daughter and my nephew are formed for each other. They are descended on the maternal side from the same noble line, and on the father's from respectable, honourable, and ancient, though untitled, families. Their fortune on both sides is splendid. They are destined for each other by the voice of every member of their respective houses. And what is to divide them? The upstart pretensions of a young woman without family connections or fortune? Is this to be endured? But it must not, shall not be. If you were sensible of your own good, you would not wish to quit the sphere in which you have been brought up. In marrying your nephew, I should not consider myself as quitting the sphere. He is a gentleman. I am a gentleman's daughter. So far we are equal." "True. You are a gentleman's daughter. But who was your mother? Who are your aunts and uncles? Do not imagine me ignorant of their condition." "Whatever my connections may be," said Elizabeth, "if your nephew does not object to them, they can be nothing to you." "Tell me at once for all, are you engaged to him?" Though Elizabeth would not, for the mere purpose of obliging Lady Catherine, have answered this question, she could not but say, after a moment's deliberation, "I am not." Lady Catherine seemed pleased. "And will you promise me never to enter into such an engagement?" "I will make no promise of the kind." "Miss Bennet, I am shocked and astonished. I expect to find a more reasonable young woman. But do not deceive yourself into a belief that I will ever recede. I shall not go away till you have given me the assurance I require. And I certainly never shall give it. I am not to be intimidated into anything so wholly unreasonable. Your ladyship wants Mr. Darcy to marry your daughter. But would my giving you the wished-for promise make their marriage at all more probable? Suppose him to be attached to me. Would my refusing to accept his hand make him wish to bestow it on his cousin? Allow me to say, Lady Catherine, that the arguments with which you have supported this extraordinary application have been as frivolous as the application was ill-judged. You have widely mistaken my character, if you think I can be worked on by such persuasions as these. How far your nephew might approve of your interference in his affairs, I cannot tell, but you most certainly have no right to concern yourself in mine. I must beg, therefore, to be importuned no farther on the subject." "Not so hasty, if you please. I have by no means done. To all the objections I have already urged, I have still another to add. I am no stranger to the particulars of your younger sister's infamous elopement. I know it all, that the young man's marrying her was a patched-up business, at the expense of your father and uncles. And is such a girl to be my nephew's sister? Is her husband, the son of his late father's steward, to be his brother? Heaven and earth! Of what are you thinking? Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?" "You can now have nothing further to say," she resentfully answered. "You have insulted me in every possible method. I must beg to return to the house." And she rose as she spoke. Lady Catherine rose also, and they turned back. Her ladyship was highly incensed. "Have you no regard, then, for the honour and credit of my nephew? Unfeeling, selfish girl! Do you not consider that a connection with you must disgrace him in the eyes of everybody?" "Lady Catherine, I have nothing further to say. You know my sentiments." "You are then resolved to have him?" "I have said no such thing. I am only resolved to act in that manner which will, in my own opinion, constitute my happiness, without reference to you, or to any person so wholly unconnected with me." "It is well. You refuse, then, to oblige me. You refuse to obey the claims of duty, honor, and gratitude. You are determined to ruin him in the opinion of all his friends, and make him the contempt of the world." "Neither duty, nor honor, nor gratitude," replied Elizabeth, "have any possible claim on me in the present instance. No principle of either would be violated by my marriage with Mr. Darcy. And with regard to the resentment of his family, or the indignation of the world, if the former were excited by his marrying me, it would not give me one moment's concern, and the world in general would have too much sense to join in the scorn." "And this is your real opinion? This is your final resolve? Very well. I shall now know how to act. Do not imagine, Miss Bennet, that your ambition will ever be gratified. I came to try you. I hoped to find you reasonable, but, depend on it, I will carry my point." In this manner Lady Catherine talked on, till they were at the door of the carriage, when, turning hastily round, she added, "I shall take no leave of you, Miss Bennet. I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention. I am most seriously displeased." Elizabeth made no answer, and without attempting to persuade her ladyship to return into the house, walked quietly into it herself. She heard the carriage drive away as she proceeded upstairs. Her mother impatiently met her at the door of the dressing-room to ask why Lady Catherine would not come in again and rest herself. "She did not choose it," said her daughter. "She would go." "She is a very fine-looking woman, and her calling here was prodigiously civil. For she only came, I suppose, to tell us the Collinses were well. She is on her road somewhere, I dare say, and so, passing through Meryton, thought she might as well call on you. I suppose she had nothing particular to say to you, Lizzie?" Elizabeth was forced to give into a little falsehood here, for to acknowledge the substance of their conversation was impossible. End of Chapter 56. Chapter 57. The discomposure of spirits which this extraordinary visit threw Elizabeth into could not be easily overcome, nor could she, for many hours, learn to think of it less than incessantly. Lady Catherine, it appeared, had actually taken the trouble of this journey from Rosings for the sole purpose of breaking off her supposed engagement with Mr. Darcy. It was a rational scheme, to be sure, but from what the reports of their engagement could originate, Elizabeth was at a loss to imagine, till she recollected that, his being the intimate friend of Bingley, and her being the sister of Jane, was enough, at a time when the expectation of one wedding made everybody eager for another, to supply the idea. She had not herself forgotten to feel that the marriage of her sister must bring them more frequently together. And her neighbours at Lucas Lodge, therefore, for through their communication with the Collinses, the report, she concluded, had reached Catherine, had only set that down as almost certain and immediate, which she had looked forward to as possible at some future time. In revolving Lady Catherine's expressions, however, she could not help feeling some uneasiness as to the possible consequence of her persisting in this interference. From what she had said of her resolution to prevent their marriage, it occurred to Elizabeth that she must mediate an application to her nephew, and how he might take a similar representation of the evils attached to a connection with her, she dared not pronounce. She knew not the exact degree of his affection for his aunt, or his dependence on her judgment, but it was natural to suppose that he had thought much higher of her ladyship than she could do, and it was certain that, in enumerating the miseries of a marriage with one whose immediate connections were so unequal with his own, his aunt would address him on his weakest side. With his notions of dignity, he would probably feel that the arguments, which to Elizabeth had appeared weak and ridiculous, contained much good sense and solid reasoning. If he had been wavering before as to what he should do, which had often seemed likely, the advice and entreaty of so near a relation might settle every doubt, and determine him at once to be as happy as dignity unblemished could make him. In that case, he would return no more. Lady Catherine might see him in her way through town, and his engagement to Bingley of coming against to Netherfield must give way. If, therefore, an excuse for not keeping his promise should come to his friend within a few days, she added, I shall know how to understand it. I shall then give over every expectation, every wish of his constancy. If he is satisfied with only regretting me, when he might have obtained my affections in hand, I shall soon cease to regret him at all. The surprise of the rest of the family, on hearing who the visitor had been, was very great, but they obligingly satisfied it with the same kind of supposition which had appeased Miss Bennet's curiosity, and spared Elizabeth from much teasing on the subject. The next morning, as she was going downstairs, she was met by her father, who came out of his library with a letter in his hand. "Lizzie," said he, "I was going to look for you. Come into my room." She followed him thither, and her curiosity to know what he had to tell her was heightened by the supposition of its being in some manner connected with the letter he held. It suddenly struck her that it might be from Lady Catherine, and she anticipated with dismay all the consequent explanations. She followed her father to the fireplace, and they both sat down. He then said, "I have received a letter this morning that has astonished me exceedingly. As it principally concerns yourself, you ought to know its contents. I did not know before that I had 2 daughters on the brink of matrimony. Let me congratulate you on a very important conquest." The colour now rushed into Elizabeth's cheeks, in the instantaneous conviction of its being a letter from the nephew instead of the aunt, and she was undetermined whether most to be pleased that he explained himself at all, or offended that his letter was not rather to address to herself, when her father continued, "You look conscious. Young ladies have a great penetration in such matters as these, but I think I may defy even your sagacity to discover the name of your admirer. This letter is from Mr. Collins." "From Mr. Collins? And what can he have to say?" "Something very much to the purpose, of course. He begins with congratulations on the approaching nuptials of my eldest daughter, of which, it seems, he has been told by some of the good-natured gossiping Lucases. I shall not sport with your impatience by reading what he says on that point. What relates to yourself is as follows. Having thus offered you the sincerest congratulations of Mrs. Collins and myself on this happy event, let me now add a short hint on the subject of another, of which we have been advised by the same authority. Your daughter Elizabeth, it is presumed, will not long bear the name of Bennet, after her elder sister has resigned it, and the chosen partner of her fate may be reasonably looked up to as one of the most illustrious personages in the land. Can you possibly guess, Lizzie, who is meant by this? This young gentleman is blessed, in a peculiar way, with everything the heart of a mortal can most desire. Splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage. Yet, in spite of all these temptations, let me warn my cousin Elizabeth, and yourself, of what evils you may incur by a precipitate closure with this gentleman's proposal, which, of course, you will be inclined to take immediate advantage of. Have you any idea, Lizzie, who this gentleman is? But now it comes out. My motive for cautioning you is as follows. We have reason to imagine that his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, does not look on the match with a friendly eye. Mr. Darcy, you see, is the man. Now, Lizzie, I think I have surprised you. Could he or the Lucases have pitched on any man within the circle of our acquaintance whose name would have given the lie more effectively to what they related? Mr. Darcy, who never looks at a woman but to see a blemish, and who probably never looked at you in his life? It is admirable." Elizabeth tried to join her father's pleasantry, but could only force one most reluctant smile. Never had his wit been directed in a manner so little agreeable to her. "Are you not diverted?" "Are you not diverted?" "Oh, yes. Pray read on." After mentioning the likelihood of this marriage to her ladyship last night, she immediately, with her usual condescension, expressed what she felt on the occasion, when it became apparent that in the score of some family objections on the part of my cousin, she would never give her consent to what she termed so disgraceful a match. I thought it my duty to give the speediest intelligence of this to my cousin, that she and her noble admirer may be aware of what they are about, and not run hastily into a marriage that has not been properly sanctioned. Mr. Collins moreover adds, "I am truly rejoiced that my cousin Lydia's sad business has been so well hushed up, and am only concerned that their living together before marriage took place should be so generally known. I must not, however, neglect the duties of my station, or refrain from declaring my amazement at hearing that she received the young couple into your house as soon as they were married. It was an encouragement of vice, and had I been the rector of Longbourn, I should very strenuously have opposed it. You ought certainly to forgive them, as a Christian, but never admit them into your sight, or allow their names to be mentioned in your hearing." "That is his notion of Christian forgiveness?" The rest of his letter is only about his dear Charlotte's situation, and his expectation of a young olive branch. But, Lizzie, you did not look as if you enjoyed it. You are not going to be missish, I hope, and pretend to be affronted at an idle report. For what do we live, but to make sport for our neighbours, and to laugh at them in our own turn?" "Oh," cried Elizabeth, "I am excessively diverted. But it is so strange." "Yes, that is what makes it amusing. Had they fixed on any other man, it would have been nothing. But his perfect indifference, and your pointed dislike, make it so delightfully absurd. Much as I abominate writing, I would not give up Mr. Collins's correspondence for any consideration. Nay, when I read a letter of his, I cannot help giving him the preference, even over Wickham, as much as I value the impudence and hypocrisy of my son-in-law. And pray, Lizzie, what said Lady Catherine about this report? Did she call to refuse her consent?" To this question his daughter replied only with a laugh, and as it had been asked without the least suspicion, she was not distressed by his repeating it. Elizabeth had never been more at a loss to make her feelings appear what they were not. It was necessary to laugh, when she would rather have cried. Her father had most cruelly mortified her by what he said of Mr. Darcy's indifference, and she could do nothing but perhaps wonder at such a want of penetration, or fear that perhaps, instead of his seeing too little, she might have fancied too much. End of chapter 57. Recorded by Susan Hooks, Tokyo, Japan.
Or attachment, Mr. Darcy. Or in other words, you are determined to have him. He is rich, to be sure, and you may have more fine clothes and fine carriages than Jane, but will they make you happy? Have you any other objection, said Elizabeth, than your belief of my indifference? Not at all. We all know him to be a proud, unpleasant sort of man, but this would do nothing if you really liked him. I do like him, she replied with tears in her eyes. I love him. Indeed, he has no improper pride. He is perfectly amiable. You do not know what he really is, and pray do not pain me by speaking of him in such terms. Lizzie, said her father, I have given him my consent. He is the kind of man, indeed, to whom I should never dare refuse anything which he condescended to ask. I now give it to you, if you are resolved on having him. But let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. Child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. You know not what you are about. Elizabeth, still more affected, was earnest and solemn in her reply, and at length there were repeated assurances that Mr. Darcy was really object of her choice, by explaining the gradual change which her estimation of him had undergone, relating her absolute certainty that his affection was not for a good day, but had stood the test of many months of suspense, and enumerating with energy all his good qualities, she did conquer her father's incredulity, and reconcile him to the match. Well, my dear, said he when she ceased speaking, I have no more to say. If this be the case, I deserve you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less sorely. To complete the favourable impression, she then told him what Mr. Darcy had voluntarily done for Lydia. He heard her with astonishment. This isn't even the wonders indeed. And so Darcy did everything. Made Smash give the money, paid the fellow's debts, and got him his commission. So much the better. It will save me a world of trouble and economy. Had it been your uncle's doing, I must and would have paid him. But these violent young lovers carry everything their own way. I shall offer to pay him tomorrow. He will rent a small mouse for you, and there will be an end of the matter. He then recollected her embarrassment a few days before, on his reading Mr. Collins's letter, and after laughing at her some time, allowed her at last to go, saying as she quitted the room, "If any young man come for Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am quite to leave her." Elizabeth's mind was now relieved from a very heavy weight, and after half an hour quiet reflection in her own room, she was able to join the others with tolerable composure. Everything was too recent for gaiety, but the evening passed tranquilly away. There was no longer anything serious to be dreaded, and the comfort of ease and familiarity would come in time. When her mother went up to her dressing room at night, she followed her, and made the important communication. Its effect was most extraordinary, for on first hearing it, Mrs. Bennet sat quite still, and unable to utter a syllable. Nor was it under many, many minutes she could comprehend what she heard, though not to general backward credit what was for the advantage of her family, or that came in the shape of a lover to any of them. She began at length to recover, to fidget about in her chair, get up, sit down again, wonder and bless herself. Good gracious! Lord bless me! Only think! Dear me! Mr. Darcy! Who would have thought it? It is pretty true! Oh, my sweet Lizzie! How rich and how brave you will be! What pinmoney! Which jewels! What carriages you will have! Ain't this nothing to you, nothing at all! I am so pleased, so happy! Such a charming man, so handsome, so tall! Oh, my dear Lizzie, I apologize for my having disliked you so much before. I hope you will overlook it. Dear, dear Lizzie, a house in town, everything that is charming. 3 daughters married, 10,000 a year. Oh, Lord, what will become of me? I shall have distracted. This was enough to prove that her approbation need not be doubted, and Elizabeth, rejoicing that such an effusion was heard only by herself, soon went away. But before she had been 3 minutes in her own room, her mother followed her. My dear child, she cried, I can think of nothing else. 10,000 a year, and very likely more. 'Tis good of the Lord, and as better licensed. You must and shall be married by such a license. But, my dearest, tell me what dish Miss Darcy is particularly fond of. I am had tomorrow. This was a sad omen of what her mother's behaviour to the gentleman himself might be, and Elizabeth found that, though in certain possession of his warmest affection, and secure of her religious consent, there was still something to be wished for. But the morrow passed off much better than she expected, for Mrs. Bennet luckily stood in such awe of her intended son-in-law that she ventured not to speak to him, unless it was in her power to offer him any attention, or mark her deference for his opinion. Elizabeth had satisfaction in seeing her father taking pains to get acquainted with him, and Mr. Bennet soon assured her that he was rising every hour in his esteem. I admire all my three son-in-laws highly, said he. William perhaps my favourite, but I think I shall like your husband quite as well as Jane's. End of chapter 59. This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Anne Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in January 2006. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Chapter 60. Elizabeth's spirit soon wasted to playfulness again. She went to Mr. Darcy to account for his having ever fallen in love with her. How did you begin? Said she. I can comprehend your going on charmingly, when you had once made a beginning. What could set you off in the first place? I cannot fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew that I had begun. My beauty you had early withstood, and as for my manners, my behaviour to you was at least always bordering on the uncivil, that I proposed to you without rather wishing to give you pain than not. Now be sincere. Did you admire me for my impertinence? For the loftiness of your mind, I did. You may as well call it impertinence at once. It was very little less. The fact is that you were sick of civility, of deference, of official attention. You were disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for your approbation alone. I aroused and interested you, because I was so unlike them. Had you not been really amiable, you would have hated me for it. In spite of the pains you took to disguise yourself, your feelings were always noble and just, and in your heart you thoroughly despised the persons who so assiduously courted you. There, I have saved you the trouble of accounting for it, and really, all things considered, I begin to think it perfectly reasonable. To be sure, you knew no actual good of me, but nobody thinks of that when they fall in love. Was there no good in your affectionate behaviour to Jane while she was ill at Netherfield? Dearest Jane, who could have been less for her? But make virtue of it by all means. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to guide them as much as possible, and in return it belongs to me to find occasions for teasing and quarrelling with you such as may be, and I shall begin directly by asking what made you so unwilling to come to the point at last. What made you so shy of me when you first called, and afterwards stayed here? Why, especially when you called, did you look as if you did not care about me? Because you were and silent and gave me no encouragement. But I was embarrassed, and so was I. You meant to talk to me more when you came to dinner. The men who have felt less might. How unlucky that you should have a reasonable answer to give, and that I should be so reasonable as to admit. I wonder how long you would have gone on if you had much yourself. I wonder when you would have spoken if I had not asked you. My resolution of thanking you for your kindness to Lydia has certainly great effect, too, I am afraid, for what comes of moral, if our comfort springs from a reach of promise, for I ought not to amend in the subject. This will never do. You need not distrust yourself. The moral will be perfectly fair. Lady Catherine, unjustifiable endeavour to separate us, were the means of removing all my doubts. I am not indebted for my present happiness to your eager desire of expressing your gratitude. I was not in any humour to wait for any opening of yours. My aunt's intelligence had given me hope. I was determined at once to know everything. Lady Catherine had been of infinite use, which ought to make her happy, for she loves to give use. But tell me, what did you condemn Netherfield for? Was it merely to run to Longbourn and be embarrassed, or had you intended any more serious consequence? My real purpose was to see you, and to judge, if I could, whether I might ever hope to make you love me. My vowed one, or what I vowed to myself, was to see whether your sister was still partial to Bingley, and if she were, to make a confession to him which I have since made. Shall you ever have heard to announce Lady Catherine what is to befall her? I am more likely to want more time than courage, Elizabeth, but it ought to be done. If you'll give me a sheet of paper, it shall be done directly. If I had not let her write myself, I might sit by you and admire Ian's severe writing, as another young lady once did. But I had an aunt, too, who must not be long neglected. From an unwillingness to confess how much her intimacy with Mr. Darcy had been overrated, Elizabeth had never yet answered Mrs. Gardiner's long letter. But now, having next to communicate what she knew would be most welcome, she was almost ashamed to find that her uncle and aunt had already lost 3 days' happiness, and immediately wrote as follows. I would have thanked you before, my dear aunt, as I ought to have done, for your long, kind, satisfactory, detailed particulars, but to tell the truth I was too cross to write. You supposed more than really existed, but now, suppose as much as you choose, give a loose rein to your fancy, indulge your imagination in every possible light which the subject will afford, and unless you believe me actually married, you cannot greatly err. You must begin very soon and praise him a great deal more than you did in your last. Thank you, again and again, for not going to the lakes. How could I be so silly as to wish it? Your idea of ponies is delightful. People will run the park every day. I am the happiest creature in the world. Perhaps other people have said so before, but not one with such justice. I am happier even than Jane. She owns smiles. I laugh. Mr. Darcy sends you all the love in the world that he can spare from me, who are all come to Pemberley at Christmas. Yours, Sarah. Mr. Darcy's letter to Lady Catherine was in a different style, and still different from either was what Mr. Bennet sent to Mr. Collins in reply to his last. Dear Sir, I must trouble you once more for congratulations. Elizabeth will soon be the wife of Mr. Darcy. Console Lady Catherine as well as you can. If I were you, I would stand by nephew. He has more to give. Yours sincerely, etc. Miss Bingley's congratulations to her brother on his approaching marriage were all out with affection and sincere. She wrote to even Jane on the occasion to express her delight and repeat all former professions of regard. Jane was not deceived, but she was affected, and though feeling no reliance on her, could not help writing her a much kinder answer than she knew to deserve. The joy which Miss Darcy expressed on receiving similar information was as sincere as her brother's in sending it. 4 sides of paper were insufficient to contain all her delight, and her earnest desire of being loved by her sister. Before any answer could arrive from Mr. Collins, or any congratulations to Elizabeth from his wife, the Longbourn family heard that the Collinses were going themselves to Luke's lodge. The reason of the sudden removal was soon evident. Lady Catherine had been rendered so exceedingly angry by the content of her nephew's letter that Charlotte, really rejoicing in the match, was anxious to get away till the storm was blown over. At such a moment, the arrival of her friend was a sincere pleasure to Elizabeth, but in the course of their meetings, she must sometimes think the pleasure dearly bought when she saw Mr. Darcy exposed to all the parading and obsequious civility of her husband. He bore it, however, with admirable calmness. He would even listen to Sir William Lucas when complimenting to him on carrying away the brightest jewel of the country, and expressed his hopes of their all meeting frequently at St. James's, with very decent composure. If he had shrugged his shoulders, it was not till Sir William was out of sight. Mrs. Phillips's vulgarity was another, and perhaps a greater tax on his forbearance. Though Mrs. Phillips, as well as her sister, stood in too much awe of him to speak with familiarity with Bingley's good humour encouraged, yet whenever she did speak, she must be vulgar. Nor was her respect for him, though it made her more quiet, at all likely to make her more elegant. Elizabeth did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and was ever anxious to keep him to herself, and with those of her family with whom he might converse without mortification, and though the uncomfortable feeling arising from all this took from the season of courtship much of its pleasure, it added to the hope of the future, and she looked forward with delight to the time when they should be removed from society, so little leading to either, to all the comfort and elegance of the family party at Pemberley. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61. Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet got rid of her 2 most deserving daughters. With what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mrs. Bingley, and talked to Mrs. Darcy, may be best. I wish I could say, for the sake of her family, the accomplishment of her earnest desire, and the establishment of so many of her children proved so happy an effect, as to make her a sensible, amiable, and formidable woman for the rest of her life. Though perhaps it was lucky for her husband, who might not have relished domestic felicity in so unusual a form, she still was occasionally nervous, and invariably silly. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter exceedingly. His affection for her drew him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley, especially when he was least expected. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherfield only a 12-month. So near a vicinity to her mother and married to relations was not desirable even to his easy temper or her affectionate heart. The darling wish of his sisters was then gratified. He bought a estate in neighbouring county to Derbyshire, and Jane and Elizabeth, in addition to every other source of happiness, were within 30 miles of each other. Kitty, to her very material advantage, spent the chief of her time with her 2 elder sisters. In society so superior to what she had generally known, her improvement was great. She was not of so unconvertible a temper as Leah, and removed from the influence of Leah's example, she became, by proper attention and management, less irritable, less ignorant, and less insipid. From the further disadvantage of Leah's society, she was of course carefully kept. And though Mrs. Wickham frequently invited her to stay with her, with the promise of balls and young men, her father would never consent to her going. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and she was necessarily drawn from the pursuit of accomplishments by Mrs. Bennet's being quite unable to sit alone. Mary was obliged to mix more with the world, but she could still moralize over every morning visit. As she was no longer mortified by comparisons between her sister's youth and her own, it was suspected by her father that she submitted to change without much reluctance. As for Wickham and Lydia, their characters suffered no revolution from the marriage of her sisters. He bore with philosophy that Elizabeth must now become acquainted with whatever of his ingratitude and falsehood before been unknown to her, and in spite of everything was not wholly without hope that Darcy might yet prevail on to make his fortune. The congratulatory letter which Elizabeth received from Leah on her marriage explained to her that, by his wife at least, if not by himself, such hope was cherished. The letter was to this effect: My dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you love Mr. Darcy half as well as Lizzie, my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It is a great comfort to have you so rich, and when you have nothing else to do, I hope you will think of us. I am sure Wickham would like a place court very much, and I do not think we will have quite money enough to live upon without some help. Any place would do, about 3 or 4 a year. But however, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it, if you had rather not. Yours, etc. As it happened that Elizabeth had much rather not, she endeavoured in her answer to put an end to every entreaty and expectation of the kind. Such relief, however, as it was in her power to afford, by the practice of what might be called economy and her own private expenses, she frequently sent them. It had always been evident to her that such an income as theirs, under the direction of two persons so extravagant in their wants and hidden of the future, must be very insufficient to their support, and whenever they changed their quarters, either Jane or herself was sure of being applied to for some little assistance towards discharging their bills. Their manner of living, even when restoration of peace dismissed them to a home, was unsettled in the extreme. They were always moving from place to place in quest of a cheap situation, and always spending more than they ought. His affection for her soon sunk into indifference. Hers lasted a little longer, and in spite of her youth and her manners, she retained all the claims of reputation which her marriage had given her. Though Darcy could never receive him at Pemberley, yet, for Elizabeth's sake, he assisted him further in his profession. Betty was occasionally visited there when her husband was gone to enjoy himself in London or Bath, and with the Bingleys, they both of them frequently stayed so long that even Bingley's good humour was overcome, and he proceeded so far as to talk of giving them a hint to be gone. Miss Bingley was very deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, and as she thought it advisable to retain the right of visiting at Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment, was fonder than ever of Georgiana, almost as attentive to Darcy as heretofore, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. Pemberley was now Georgiana's home, and the attachment of the sisters was exactly what Darcy had hoped to see. They were able to love each other even as well as they intended. Georgiana had the highest opinion in the world of Elizabeth, though at first she often listened with an astonishment bordering on alarm at her lively sordid manner of talking to her brother. He, who had always inspired in herself a respect which almost overcame her affection, she now saw the object of open pleasantry. Her mind received knowledge which had never before fallen in her way. By Elizabeth's instructions, she began to comprehend that a woman may take liberty with her husband, which a brother will not always allow in a sister more than 10 years younger than himself. Lady Catherine was extremely indignant on the marriage of her nephew, and as she gave way to all the genuine frankness of her character in her reply to the letter which announced its arrangement, she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time all intercourse was at an end. But at length, by Elizabeth's persuasion, he was prevailed on to overlook the offence, and seek a reconciliation, and after a little further resistance on the part of his aunt, her resentment gave way, either to her affection for him, or her curiosity to see how his wife conducted herself, and she condescended to wait on Pemberley, in spite of the pollution which its voice had received, not merely from the presence of such a mistress, but the visits of her uncle and aunt from the city. With the gardeners, they were always on the most intimate terms. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them, and they were both ever sensible of warmest gratitude towards the persons who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had been the means of uniting them. End of chapter 61, and end of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen.